Welcome everyone to this afternoon's session of the Levelling Up Housing Committee's Select Committee. It's our final evidence session with two panels this afternoon to look at our inquiry into children, young people and the built environment. Something I think has been very interesting so far for committee members, and I hope for other people watching. Perhaps we don't always consider children and how policy relates to them and how what we do affects them, and indeed do we actually ask them about what should be done in terms of their lives. So lots of questions around that we want to explore this afternoon. Before we begin that, ask committee members to put on the record any interest they may have that may be relevant to our inquiry. I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association.
A member of Bedford Town Deal Board and employee councillor in my constituency office.
Mm-hmm. I also employ a councillor in my constituency office.
Okay.
Tom Hunt. I employ two councillors in my constituency office, and I sit on the Ipswich Town Deal Board.
Right.
I am a Vice President of the Local Government Association, and I employ a councillor in my work.
I'm a Vice President of the LGA and on the Northampton Forward Board.
Okay, right. That's our interest declared. Can I come over to our two witnesses and ask you to introduce yourselves and just say who you are as well?
Hi, good afternoon everyone. It's good to be here. My name is Joanna. Averley. I'm the Chief Planner in DLUC, Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, so the Senior Urban Planner in Government.
Afternoon everyone. I'm Jeanelle Gruchy. I am Deputy Chief Medical Officer for England, and I lead the Office of Health Improvement and Disparities within Department of Health and Social Care.
Right. Thank you both for coming this afternoon. When we say to people, well, yeah, we're going to look as politicians at play, they probably look at us a bit gone out and think, well, isn't that something that just happens? Why do you need policies? Why do you need MPs to get involved in having a look at it? So is this something that's got to be taken seriously, you know, children, young persons play, or is it something we should just think, well, they get on with it, don't they?
Okay, on evidence first.
Yeah, great. Play is really, really important. Being physically active, I would probably frame it as being physically active, interacting, developing skills of interaction, and I think that's really important to think about it. Though, if I may, just frame it. I think why it's important for you to talk about it is actually children and young people make up a third of the population. So we're talking about a lot of children and young people in our population and their health, and I would look at it from the lens of health. So how does this contribute towards their health? It does. Being physically active really does over their life course, and starting young and play as part of that is really important. Sets up behaviours. Being physically active, interacting with others that stay with them, hopefully, over a life course. The environment and socioeconomic factors are really important in terms of how much children are physically active, how much they play, and issues around that, particularly around deprivation, will also impact on that. And so you can see there can be quite a lot of inequalities in that. I think that there have been improvements in terms of children's health, and if I was looking compared to other high-income countries, there are some metrics that have improved. So I was looking at road traffic accident mortality. Now, hopefully that's not because we've just banned, kids have stopped playing in the streets. Hopefully that is other road traffic measures, but that is positive. However, there are real negative trends that I think we need to be concerned about. So rising obesity, concerns around physical inactivity, and also air quality. So where children play, where they're physically active, how they interact, how they get around from where they live to their schools, to where they to parks and so on, is really important. And the inequalities in terms of how they do that will really impact on the way in which they start life and how they go on, and their health later, well, immediate and later, and their life expectancy, in fact.
Just to add to that, if I may, obviously within the planning system specifically, as we know, the planning system aims to deliver economic objectives, social objectives and environmental objectives, and the planning system in the National Planning Policy Framework is very clear that it's to support strong, vibrant and healthy communities. And then we go on to describe what some of those things are and how they're manifested through both how a local plan is prepared, but then how individual decisions are made. And I'm sure that's something we'll come to in questions. But just extending Jeanelle's point to, I think as the health evidence would show, as you start life, it can set a certain pattern in terms of health, and that's why obviously the government have adopted levelling up missions, one of which is to reduce the gap in healthy life expectancy in the population across the country, which in the worst cases for some women between the worst and the best performing parts of the country is 12 years, and with an objective of narrowing that down to 5 years by 2035. So the habits, I suppose, started in early life and how they play through to the full length of a healthy life, I think we would say is important.
Right, just to follow up then. Dr. Gruchy, you've done some research about obesity and the really awful level of obesity of children leaving primary school. I think 1 in 3 children are regarded as overweight. Do you think that's down to lack of facilities for play, for active travel, for the sorts of things that perhaps historically children would simply have done? And during COVID, did we learn anything then about the value of open space, or have we now just forgotten about it? Was that short term, we needed it during COVID, but we've moved on now and ignoring the lessons that we learned?
So a lot in that. I think there are a lot of things that are interconnected, and I think the built environment is really so important in terms of the way we are physically active, how active we are, as well as, of course, the food that we have access to. So if I can take one example, because I think you mentioned COVID, we know that young children, toddlers, young children that go into play areas, that they really do develop skills there, and skills that will stay with them for life. So we know from COVID that we've seen a reduction in major motor, your motor skills, and in 2 and 2.5-year-olds, which is quite dramatic, really. And we know that because they were in the house, they weren't getting out, they weren't able to get out, to play, to see others, to really try and experience life. So I think starting from that really young age, you can see how children need to be able to feel safe in their homes, be active in their homes. So if you've got overcrowded homes or cold or problem with homes, it starts really young. So there needs to be something about the safety of the home, when they get out, how they go to schools, whether they go through neighbourhoods that are safe, that don't have lots of advertising of fast food, and the fast food takeaways are there. There's lots of convenience stores with sweets and so on. It's how they get to school is important. The school environment, whether they're able to play, whether there's green spaces for them to interact with, and then how they can socialise safely in green spaces, in parks. However, after school, I think all of that is really important in terms of the environment that we would want for our children. And I think some of those things aren't right, and which is why you then start to see poor outcomes in terms of overweight and obesity and those levels rising, but also the big inequalities within that. So on that, if I could just give you the inequalities figures, in reception, the rate of obesity is double for those in the most deprived areas to those in the least deprived areas. So there's something in that environment, that is really contributing to that rising level. I mean, it's obesity levels are problematic for all our children, young people, but there is that inequality. By the time they're in year 6, that has widened even more. So in terms of obesity, in the most deprived areas, 30%. of Year 6 are obese, compared to 13% in the least deprived. So some really stark inequalities, and that then sets them up for potentially, at the time, their problems and issues, but it also sets them up for poorer outcome, perhaps, in terms of health, long-term conditions, and lower healthy life expectancy, which, as Joanna says, is something that the government is committed to reducing.
Joanna, do you want to add anything to that? And then do you want to say about how your officers work together? Because one of the things I think we're beginning to find out in our inquiry is that joined-up government isn't always the given in trying to address these issues.
Yeah, certainly. One very specific piece of policy, and then another more wide-ranging piece of policy which is really starting to have impact. And I think it's important to say that obviously within DLUP we set the framework for local government to both adopt and implement policy at a local level, both within the preparation of local plans but also in their individual development management decisions. So speaking specifically to access to healthy food, I think a very good example is the work done with TCPA and Sport England and others talking about healthier food environments. And in that, a very specific way of helping local authorities think through how to provide an appropriate evidence base to basically manage the number of fast food outlets that may be near a school and within a sort of walking catchment of a school. So to encourage, or rather discourage, children to be making poor health choices in terms of what they're eating in and around school. And it's quite a difficult thing to manage. You need a certain amount of evidence when you're particularly at planning appeal, so that there's something where different agencies got together to provide a template for local authorities to be able to provide appropriate evidence when coming up against decisions. So that's just something very, very specific, but particularly speaks to the obesity point. The other thing that I think is very telling and is showing real dividends in terms of how people are thinking about the design, design of places in totality, is active design principles prepared by people like Active Travel England as an ALB to the government and Department of Transport, and also again in partnership with Sport England. And there are 10 principles. I mean, to us it might seem very sensible, but sometimes it's really important to record a set of expectations and ambitions for designing a place or managing an existing place. That's what we're all about in terms of planning and particularly key elements of public health. And the Highland principle is activity for all, promoting activity for all. And there's a very simple principle that if you design for a child, you're pretty much designing for anybody. And in terms of mobility, distance, walking, ability to stop and rest, and so on. And then how to support active travel. So turning on its head how we design for places. So we design for people walking and cycling first, and the car is then in its rightful place in terms of the built environment. So communities that are walkable, that connect up with different travel modes, particularly public transport, that they're safe, there's good signage and lighting, mixing and co-locating uses, obviously, that public space is multifunctional, that you can both play there, you can rest there. You might even be dealing with environmental issues within a public space, whether that's shade or sustainable urban drainage. That the street's designed with people in mind, providing activity infrastructure, so obviously access to sport facilities and the like, or just a playground, and active buildings inside and out so that people might comfortably move through a building, and then maintaining high quality flexible spaces and activating spaces, through different events and so on. Now, obviously, those are principles. What we've been doing and what is very present in the planning system is how those come to light in terms of individual decisions. And the National Model Design Code in particular draws those issues to the fore when looking at how you design public space, streets, a new housing environment, and how you incorporate play. And in particular, N1 is about providing a network of high-quality green open spaces with a variety of landscapes and activities, including play. So these principles are laid out in the National Model Design Code. It's a very user-friendly document that provides both diagrams and a really good checklist of things.
We'll come on to those details about the codes in due course. Andrew, you've got a follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, I think there'll be general agreement about what you say about the accessibility of play areas and green spaces for people, particularly when there's a new estate or an expansion to a community going on. Slightly unsettled by your reference to managing evidence in terms of trying to come up with ways of saying that fast food outlets should be stopped and trying to find evidence to prove that they are necessarily leading people into making bad decisions for their health, versus the concept of parental responsibility and children being educated in terms of their public health, their health and therefore public health, to make sensible decisions for themselves, rather than managing evidence, as you put it, to suggest that if someone walks past 3 fast food restaurants rather than 1, they will perforce make a bad decision. And given limited resources and that philosophical difference, do you think the emphasis ought to be more on green spaces and accessibility for people to be able to make sensible decisions for themselves?
Yes, I mean, it's a very particular issue about fast food takeaways, and it's a very pointed piece of policy where, when local authorities are trying to manage a significant number of fast food outlets near a school, that they've got the ability to do that. Obviously, the broader piece is about how an entire environment, neighbourhood, functions for children and young people, and has access to green space, has got safe streets, has got space, streets that young people feel comfortable walking down or cycling along. So it's the totality of the design of the place that has to work. That's just one very specific aspect where the evidence is important when you're, for example, considering a scheme that's going to planning appeal, and where the evidence has to be put forward.
I think if I can just come in though, I do think we have an issue when children in more deprived areas have 5 times the amount of fast food takeaways in their area than children in more affluent areas. So I think when I was a local director of public health, we certainly had issues where children, the overweight and obesity was in areas that had much more concentration of unhealthy food through the fast food takeaways. So,
but is that cause and effect? I mean, the fact that there's lots of them that happen to be there, is that leading to those children choosing to do that more, or is that children in that area at the moment choose to do that more? And if our education system was better in terms of people's focus on their health and positive decisions, that wouldn't happen, rather than if they weren't there, they wouldn't make that decision.
The planning system has to weigh off different things, and obviously at national government we set the overarching framework for the planning system. It's very much to the discretion of local authorities where they feel that there would be a problem where they might want to act and take action if there's a proliferation of fast food. And connected, the whole point would be, is whether that's connected to evidence of a problem of unhealthy eating leading to obesity. So we're not prescribing this at a national level. It's something has to be done, but it's giving options to local authorities to act to make the case if they think that's something that they need to do.
Okay, Mary, thank you.
Thank you. It's slightly moving on from that, but around the same points. The comparators with COVID were really interesting, Jeanelle, and what happened there and the impact on young people. And of course, a lot of young people were at home with parents, etc. But there was also the encouragement to go out and about more, and the opportunity to be out and about. But yet we saw young children starting school not able to use a knife and fork, and not able to maybe go to the toilet. Things that you would think were just really commonplace issues around raising children. I mean, how do you place the two comparators in terms of health and safety and the well-being of children as being at home, inside, maybe online, and being outdoors?
Well, I think it depends very much on your house and your housing environment. And what we would want for our children is to have a secure house that isn't crowded, that isn't cold and damp or has mold in it, that they have space and feel the ability to play and to be physically active, and that ideally have both an immediate garden or green space on the doorstep that they can run around with, as well as a green or blue space that they can access as well. And I think all of that is really important. I think different communities experience COVID differently, and so you will see a difference in terms of that impact. And perhaps parents were parents that were working from home, there might have been a different interaction with children than parents who were still having to go out and leaving their children there, who weren't going to schools or weren't going to care into daycare and so on. So I do think that was probably a difference. So there were inequalities in terms of the children's experience and the ability for parents to provide that added extra that kids need in terms of connecting with others.
I suppose it moves on to saying if we were able to, if a parent was able to open the door and the child was able to go out and play, and this is the childhood that I had, what are the cultural issues that are stopping that? Have we changed in the way that we view and perceive children out, maybe on their own, or a couple of young children not being supervised by adults? Has that changed?
I think invariably it has. Access to technology changes behaviour, doesn't it? And like you, I would have been told to go out on the street and not come back till 5 o'clock, and that was the habit of childhood. I think there is definitely a sort of entertainment is packaged differently, it's accessible in a different way, and I think that plays out. I think what, as I say, at a national level, it's about providing the framework to help local authorities make the right choices and have the data at their fingertips to be able to plan for their communities and their neighbourhoods. And one of the things I think that's been quite powerful in that regard is the work that Natural England have done on the Green Infrastructure Framework, which has many elements to it, but one of the really powerful things is they've mapped actually the provision of green space and parks, those formal and slightly less formal, and out of which you can establish where there's a deficit or a lack of provision for communities, and that work is set alongside a set of standards, which basically amalgamates lots of different standards for sort of play and access to play and green space that's been used over the country, and then proposes optional standards to be used at a local level, and also very practical how-to guides. The one thing I want to mention is the digital mapping, which actually again enables you to analyse and local authorities analyse the provision within their communities and the catchments that relate to it. And on that basis, the 100 public spaces funded through the Levelling Up Parks Fund, and those communities were identified and £9 million committed to those projects. So that's about connecting information and data to communities and then impacting hopefully on the real world experience of the children who live there.
So much of what we do seems to be getting adults fitter and healthier. We're kind of recognising the problem is there and trying to deal with it. And you've obviously talked about the importance of setting those behaviours early in life. I can look constantly and find public health campaigns around being a healthier adult and what I should be doing. Do we need to have public health awareness or campaigns around children and how with parents, with professionals, to actually encourage this outdoor play?
I think certainly OHID, Department of Health and Social Care, is doing quite a lot in terms of children, particularly young children. So the Start for Life programme, the family hubs, working with parents, parenting skills. So that's in, I think, 75 local authorities. So I think, and those are in the most deprived areas. So I think there's certainly work that's going in to support parents to learn those skills, and also their environments where they can learn how to play with children, how children need to play with each other actually, and experience different ways of growing and learning through play and being physically active. So I think there's more that can be done, but certainly focusing on those very young children is really it's cost effective because it's so important in terms of their life experience.
Anecdotally, I see a lot in press, etc., about the importance of 5 a day for your children, about what how we feed our young children, nutrients, etc., and we see it a lot in schools. But it just kind of, I'm wondering whether we're doing enough on the activities, outdoor play, and the importance of fresh air. So that's where I'm getting to with that. Do we need to do a little bit more on that particular element?
So this afternoon I just came from the National Physical Activity Task Force, and that has got government departments really looking together, DCMS, DFE, DLUC, DHSC, and others, trying to, with arm's length bodies, so Active Travel England, Sport England, the partnerships, and others, because I think this is a whole this is national government and local government, but it's also a lot of other partners. I think that it requires a real whole society look at what is it that we're doing, what kinds of environments are we providing for our children. And I come back as well to the inequality. So some of our children are just not able to experience that real kind of best start in life. So what are the different departments doing? And I think there is a lot. So I think we've seen quite a bit of energy and effort put into the different ways in which we can try to increase the physical activity. I was talking of 0 to 5-year-olds, but we were talking about school age, and we'll be talking about adults as well. So I think there is renewed energy and focus on the children's age group for sure.
So much of the conversation at the moment is about smartphones, banning smartphones, children not using the internet, fast food advertising, all of that. Are these sticking plasters in comparison to what really needs to be done, which is to address the issues in the built environment for children?
So I think the built environment is incredibly important. In terms of your question about screen-based activities, in 2019 the UK Chief Medical Officers did look at this. They did a evidence commentary on the evidence in terms of screen-based activities in children and young people's mental health and psychological well-being. So it was primarily mental health as opposed to being physically active. But it stated that we don't have sufficient research, or it's insufficiently conclusive to support evidence-based guidelines on optimal amounts of screen-based activity. So there's research around the positive as well as the negative. But to your point, there's something about being the environment in terms of how physically active we are.
Right. Hey, thank you. And just say we need to get through all our questions, so just slightly shorter answers. That would be really helpful. It's really interesting information. We want to make sure we get it all in by the end of our session. So moving on then to the guidance, Andrew.
Thank you. Joanna, first of all, in 2009 you were Deputy Chief Exec of the Commission for Architecture in the Built Environment, CABE, and the Commission produced guidance on designing and planning for play. It's quite an interesting document. So what happened to that guidance at the time, and in terms of how it's used now, and who produces guidance like that now?
Thank you. Didn't expect to go back to 2009 and CABE, but I'm glad you did. There was a lot of work done when I was at CABE, and colleagues were working on everything from things like Start with the Park, which again was this idea about how you plan for public space very intentionally, and then, as you say, onto aspects of play. A lot of this policy now flows through in terms of various things, from the National Planning policy framework, which is very clear on the role of public space, and then through to the National Model Design Code, which is there in the absence of a design code at the local authority level. And it's a really important point to note that that is a material consideration in planning when considering planning applications. And it is, to my mind, a very good summation of all the guidance that's gone before. And points to all of those sort of key issues that both somebody promoting a development and somebody making a decision on it should have at the forefront of their minds, and we're seeing that being brought through. What is currently in policy, and particularly in the Levelling Up Regeneration Act, is that every local authority will be expected to prepare a design code for their own area, and that can then pick up some of those policies very specifically. So I think what you see is a very strong framework within, obviously, Chapter 8 of the National Planning Policy Framework in promoting healthy and safe communities, and that flowing through. And then, as I mentioned, the work on the Green Infrastructure Framework, that is very good evidence of where there might need a particular focus on increasing provision in an existing area, and then playing that through in terms of what you might expect of development as it comes through the system.
Oh, thank you. Well, similar theme to Jeanelle. There wasn't as much reference to play, children and young people in Building for a Healthy Life toolkit that we might have expected, given that it came out of the Healthy Towns programme, which had quite a lot of reference to that in it. So what happened?
The Healthy Towns programme looked at 10 particular areas that were undergoing change and I think was addressing the issue at how you design at the bigger scale, more than just an individual housing scheme of a few hundred units, but sort of much bigger than that. Building for a Healthy Life came out of Building for Life, which was a set of standards developed in about 2002 and onwards, and is used in particular by Homes England and colleagues to again consider whether schemes coming forward, particularly for funding through Homes England, whether again they're meeting the appropriate standards. And I think it's important that is set alongside any design code that will emerge at a local authority level, and as I say, the National Model Design Code in absence of that at the moment.
So Healthy Life Toolkit and Active Design Guidance, there are areas for discussion at the moment, as it's expressed. Should it be more than that? And just a more broad question, is this a question of detailed guidance, or is it actually a reflection of the fact that planning permissions and building is so constrained at the moment that there's no opportunity for people to develop at scale that actually allows for a decent amount of play space in there anyway?
I think the policy is actually very clear from the MPPF, which reference National Model Design Code and makes it a material aspect in making a planning decision, an individual permitting of a decision. So to my mind, there's a very strong framework which actually directly references the Green Infrastructure Framework as a way of establishing the supply now, where there's a lack of space and where you should be thinking about that in terms of development. I think it's for local authorities as they basically are doing pre-application work and considering individual applications to play that through, both in the preparation of their local plans, but also then individual decisions. Schemes come through, invariably there's inevitably a sort of set of balanced choices to be made, but actually the design and layout of the actual neighbourhood itself is often one of the most important aspects which will make the place a success and attractive, and also, as is evidenced, actually sustains the value of the place itself and the homes and the development. And I think what we've all probably seen as we walk around our cities is places that have invested in the built environment and the public realm in particular, and that is creating the very glue that's holding a place together and creating that value. Mayfield is a very good example in Manchester, where the public realm, with a very significant amount of play, Manchester's first big public space and park for 100 years, is coming before the development, and it's creating the very glue around which significant commercial and residential development will happen. So you can see projects where both at a regeneration urban scale or a more suburban scale are actually taking these principles through.
That's helpful, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to the MPPF, Natalie.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a huge topic, so I'm going to try and keep us reasonably focused on it to this, if I may. We've just been hearing a bit about the MPPF and its role in relation to public space, and thank you for that, Joanna. I'm mindful that at the moment we hear more about bats in the MPPF than we do about children that are nearly absent. Do you think that that's the right balance? And if I may just give you a brief example, in my constituency we have a development which famously has what we call a bat playground as well as a bat hotel. And I have another development in Walmer where it's gone into administration and the children's playground hasn't been built. And the whole of the first stage of the development is there, and there are children, and they're playing in the streets with, roads that are not finished, with paving stones that are dangerous, and who knows if the playground will survive the next building round. So do you think in setting those priorities that you're sending a clear enough message in the MPPF to make it as easy as possible to have these great lives for children?
I think the MPPF is very clear in its intent and the role of public space and play. I think ministers obviously ultimately will make the choices to the balance and weight to be put into the MPPF, but it is a policy that is designed for everyone in the community and definitely intends to do that. one of the things that it obviously does is both obviously talk about health and safe communities, but then obviously environmental, both protection and enhancement and dealing with climate change. So it always has to deal with quite a number of issues across the piece. And it does tend to talk about community rather than talk about different either age groups in the community and so on. I think what is important is that the words expressed in policy, the pictures that might be in a design code, the standards that might flow from that, then actually follow through into decision making. What government is very conscious of, ministers are very conscious of, is continually pushing for the quality and the beauty, and by beauty we mean all aspects of the built environment, both the landscape, the buildings, the very design and layout of a place, that they're as good as to the quality that we should and can expect. And for that reason, for example, the Office for Place is going to be supporting the preparation of design codes, and the NPPF is very clear in terms of expectations of quality. When it comes to obviously a scheme then delivering on the ground and following through, local authorities obviously can take enforcement action, and it's very much at their discretion to do that. If, for example, something is taken forward or not delivered, then a local authority can take action, but it's very much at the discretion of the local authority.
If I could just press on that, because I appreciate what you've said about there's a lot in it. There is, that's the point. That's why we have to specify children, isn't it? Because otherwise you talk about the environment, and you talk about a lot about the environment in this session to date. But it's not about provision for everything, is it? It's about provision for specific, it's about provision for children. So why isn't it more front and centre? And is that going to be something that is actually in these new national development management policies? Because surely if you don't set those priorities, they won't be a priority within all these judgments that have to make, and that's what we're seeing on the ground, isn't it?
I mean, it's an absolutely fair point. As we're preparing national development management policies, obviously we started provisional work on it. It'll be for ministers to decide exactly that balance of priorities and what issues to bring to the fore in terms of policies. And they will be, as I'm sure you know, there'll be a set of nationally held policies which will...
What would your advice? I mean, you're advising them. Do you not think that it would be sensible to have children and young people specifically front and centre within the NPPF, front and centre within these policies? I mean, there are objectives that Jeanelle has very helpfully set out as well. If you want to achieve these objectives, how are you going to do it if you don't say this is what matters?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think if you design for young people or people with mobility issues, you're designing for everyone. And I think it's a very healthy test as professionals to take, which is if you design for a young child who may only walk for 100 metres, or an old person who may only walk for 100 metres and both need to sit down and rest, and will have a certain attitude maybe or certain consciousness of road safety and things like that, I think it's a very good lens through which to design for everyone. Now, I think you asked me a question beyond that, which is when it comes to, for example, should there be specific mention of children and the needs of children within the NPPF? We don't say a lot about different groups. We tend to talk about the built environment in which we function and operate and live out our lives. I think it's genuinely the right question to ask, which is whether we should talk about individual groups in society within the national
that is the
policy
question
frame.
we're asking.
Yeah.
What's your view?
At the minute, policy doesn't tend to do that. It tends to talk about the built environment itself.
What's your view on this? You've done this for years.
I suppose my reflection would be is if you list one group, you end up listing about 30.
But isn't this critical? I mean, you list bats. So why are we not listing children? And you've mentioned a child who might like to toddle and rest.
Yeah.
What about those that in previous generations we've heard would run for miles? And now they're being constrained by 15, 20-minute cities. They're being constrained by parks. Doesn't it matter to actually make sure that you're actually defining specifically what matters to create really healthy, fantastic childhoods?
I do, but I think in doing that, you're not just designing for one age group. I think you're designing for all. I think
children
is my point.
Are less important.
And it's not that they're less important. It's that a successful public space will meet the needs of all age groups.
Well, we know they're less important than bats, so I'll move on than that. So if I may just follow up on this question of enforcement that you've mentioned. Planning enforcement, isn't there something in the requirement to bring forward something before others? Because you mentioned the Manchester example. Was that something that's been grant funded in any way or supported publicly?
Yes, that received levelling up funding to enable that to come forward. I thought it might be.
Yes. So if we're looking at the generality of developments, why wouldn't it be specified so make it easier for local authorities to actually make sure that playground goes, to make sure it goes in at a really early stage when those first families are in place, to make sure that roads are levelled so that children don't fall over and hurt themselves while the development's being finished. Isn't there more that you could do in your department?
I think it's really important that as developments flow through, and it depends obviously on the scale of the development. Some developments might be a few thousand homes, and the play space or the green space may come in different phases, depending on where it's located in the development. I think it's really important that local authorities do follow through on commitments, and that's in terms of conditions and other aspects of a scheme as it comes through. Because what you're highlighting is that, obviously residents have bought into a new development with an expectation of what's to come. And it's important that local authorities feel enabled to do that, which is why, as I say, they've got enforcement powers.
I think, just to be clear on my question, I wasn't suggesting that residents had bought into it. These are provisions that are essential for the safety and well-being and development of children.
Yeah.
So this isn't a sort of, I'm going to have a nice shrub at the end of my road. This is about something which is part and parcel of the well-being of the children who are within that community, people moving into houses without those facilities being in place. So it is a case that there will be priority, for example, for social and affordable housing to come forward. Well, in those instances, or indeed in any instances, isn't it the case the Parliament could do more to make sure that playgrounds and other safe spaces for children are brought forward in an earlier stage?
Each scheme, and I'm genuinely not trying to obfuscate here, I mean, each scheme has its own phasing, and each scheme will be delivered in a sort of certain order depending on, for example, if you're delivering quite a sort of dense urban development, the public space may come at the very end because it's your work site before you then,
so there's no view, you have no view, because you expressed a very clear preference in the case of Manchester that you thought that was a really good model.
Yes.
So I'm just keen to understand why it's good for Manchester but not good for Walmer in Kent.
Manchester is an interesting example because obviously with government funding the scheme was able to bring forward the public realm first, which has created a really strong brand for this new quarter to the city. I think what you're asking me is whether that should be the same condition for any development, that the public space goes in first.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is there more that you could do in terms of the guidance and the conditions that you set out for the local planning authorities to make sure that they have the tools to prioritise in the right way, because if they can prioritise, they can enforce. And you've said they can enforce, but have they got the right guidance?
I mean, that'll come through mostly through individual negotiations on an individual scheme through Section 106 agreements, and they're therefore the very particular physical form
that's
of
not
development.
The question that I'm asking. I'm not asking about do developments get decided on an individual basis. I'm saying very specifically, what is your role in making sure that children are prioritised where currently BATs are prioritised, and where playgrounds are actually part of the necessary conditions of a development, that actually those are prioritised as being delivered in a way that makes a development that is in development, as you say, in phases, a safe place for children. And I'm surprised that you don't feel that central government has a role in that.
The central government absolutely does have a role. There is national policy which talks about the importance of play and green space and their provision and the policies that should be adopted within a local plan which is locally owned, and then how those decisions then follow through in terms of individual development management decisions, which is particularly at the minute strong in the National Model Design Code as a precursor to locally adopted design codes. They are very clear in the role of green space and play within and the design of the street as being comfortable for children and both for active play but also for moving around their communities. That's very, very clear, and that priority is absolutely clear. I think what you're also moving to is asking a question about what happens if a developer doesn't then deliver.
No.
Okay, you're not. My apologies if I was
No,
misunderstanding.
I think you said very clearly you thought it was down to local authorities, so I think you've given us your answer on that. But I know we're going to ask about design codes, so I think that probably leads on to that.
Yes, we are.
It does indeed, Natalie, thank you.
Kate, I was looking at the chair to introduce.
So, why doesn't the National Model Design Code and the National Design Guide, why doesn't it cater for children? I mean, you spoke about it in very general terms, and you said it's down to local authorities, but why don't these codes have that built in?
Apologies, it does. It does make it very clear within the National Model Design Code that children's play and the provision of play should be there. and the provision of green space, and it references, as I mentioned, the Natural England's Green Infrastructure Framework, which basically analyses digitally where there's a lack of provision for green space, and then on the back of which the Levelling Up Parks Fund monies were given out, and those are material. Those are material issues that can play through into development management decisions at the moment. So the National Model Design Code does directly talk about green space and play provision and the design of streets for healthy streets and safe streets.
That doesn't seem to have followed through on what we actually see happening on the streets.
Yes, so and obviously the National Model Design Code was issued in the summer of 21. And there's obviously that is therefore for local authorities to apply that in real terms as they look at individual schemes. And obviously what we're also doing a lot of work at the moment with the preparation of area-based design codes and local design codes with local authorities, so that they can then adopt those policies for themselves at the right level of detail and at the right level of specificity for their individual local areas, and particularly reflecting the character of their places, whether they're mid-density, low-density, historic settings, more contemporary settings. And that work is actually flowing through with all these sorts of considerations applicable to that particular local authority area or community. Yeah,
it appears to me that you're telling me that the focus is on children and young people by design. I'm afraid that certainly doesn't follow through, and as Natalie said, I've got a number of new estates in my constituency, and the role always seems to be passed to local authorities, but if you actually sit on a planning committee, it appears the more emphasis on the profit and getting as many houses as possible put onto a parcel of land. So perhaps what you think is in there is probably not been read with the same importance by local authorities or even developers.
Yeah, I genuinely think that the National Model Design Code is very clear and explicit and gives very clear guidance on the issues that should be playing out in terms of development management decisions and the design of schemes before you get even to a planning application. And as I say, the NPPF makes it clear that it's a material consideration to planning applications, and it talks to all of the issues that you've been raising around the table. There's a question as to whether, as you say, that's then taken up by the decision maker and applied. But we do see schemes coming through with reference to National Model Design Code having been something that's been used to consider the scheme that's in front of decision makers.
So what more could you do to place more emphasis and more conditions perhaps to ensure it does actually happen? Because obviously it's not happening. Yes. In a number of cases.
So in the Levelling Up Regeneration Act, there'll be local authorities will be mandated, therefore required to prepare an area-wide design code for their local area. So they can use the National Model Design Code as a starting point, as a menu of issues that they should address. And those codes are intended to be very clear in terms of expectation and then feed through into decision making. In the absence of that at the moment, the National Model Design Code can be used, as well as the National Design Guide. Obviously with the setting up of the Office for Place, the objective is to make sure that local authorities are encouraged to do so, and also supported with other aspects of training and best practice exactly on this topic. We also, just as an aside, are doing lots of work in terms of capacity and capability in planning authorities. One of the organisations we fund is called Public Practice, and they are offering out to bring people into local authorities, particularly with a range of skills. And one of the skills shortages is urban design and placemaking skills. And so we're helping local authorities recruit from the private sector back into the public sector, specifically for these kinds of skills to enable both local authority officers and members to be well advised about some of these issues.
I'm afraid that the national headline and the reality are poles apart. When a planning application comes to councils, a developer can actually walk away because he won't make enough profit on a site. So there's huge disconnect between the vision and the reality. But based on that, should the London plan 10 square metres of place-based policy for new housing developments be adopted and enforceable nationally with a ban on play spaces segregated by tenure?
Yeah, so obviously the London Plan Housing Design Guide is a very good example of a locally adopted set of requirements specific for London as prepared in the London Plan. And as you say, the 5 metre expectation and requirement for 5 square metres of private outdoor space, which commonly in London is usually in the form of a balcony, is a really important thing. That's obviously adopted for London. Obviously, it will be for ministers to decide about policies that should be adopted for the whole of the country. That standard specifically is particularly relevant when you're doing medium and high-rise development, obviously, because people might not have access to private space on the ground floor because they're living at a higher density. I think the other thing that's really quite interesting in terms of the London Plan and the supplementary guidance, which I just wanted to highlight, it seems a good opportunity to do it, is the London Public Charter, which is really interesting work, which is about influencing not just new spaces but existing public spaces, because obviously some parts of the city are privately managed and owned, King's Cross, Canary Wharf, and many of our what you would have formerly considered civic environments, and the London Plan Design Guide for Housing Design Standards also references the Public London Charter, which talks about people signing up to places being welcoming, open, unrestricted use, community focused, free of charge, and actually, that the use is actually welcomed in our urban environments. And I think that is a very important aspect. But then obviously, in relation to the spaces within London's developments, there's places like Elephant Park and other schemes that have very intentionally designed the environment for children and both play and just also how they move around the development. So there are some good examples. I'm not saying everywhere's getting it right by any stretch of the imagination. We do see many schemes coming forward which aren't of the quality or of the sort of scale of provision in terms of children and play and green space, and that's why obviously the National Model Design Code was adopted, and emphasis has been very strongly put into the NPPF updates just before Christmas in terms of these wider set of issues.
So in your role as the Chief Planner for Gaylord, should you be advising ministers that new housing developments be adopted and enforceable nationally, along with a ban on play spaces segregated by tenure?
So I think you're referring to the Lillian Baylis school scheme, which you may be, which was a very particular case. Do you know about?
No, I'm talking
in general.
In general,
yeah.
Should developments have children's needs as a main focus? And rather than pass the responsibility to councils to enforce, which they can't, they may have the power, but it can't actually be done, should that be in the advice that developments need to demonstrate they've considered open spaces for children?
Developments currently have to consider open space. Invariably, children use open space. I'm not saying this to obfuscate the question. The point is that children and play space is already part of the National Model Design Code as a consideration and is material to planning applications. So it's already in policy. Now, whether it delivers the results is a secondary question. And that's a question of as to whether people are designing and people are making decisions on the basis of the policies that they can draw on to get the outcomes that they desire. Which is to your point, which is do you see it coming forward actually in the schemes that happen on the ground? And the reality is that the quality of schemes that come forward through the planning system are not necessarily at the standard as prescribed and advised in national policy. And that comes down to individual local authority decision making. And as you rightly say, sometimes viability is a consideration, affordable housing is a consideration, but these are all things that should be considered in the round at the point of decision.
I'll take that as a no. We'll
Okay.
leave it there. Thank you.
Sorry, just very briefly, if I may follow up, because I think you may tell Joanna there's some puzzled looks going around the committee over there. So I think it's just helpful if we finish this segment of information. So we got the NPPF, which is, I think, one mention of children not high on the whole subject of children. And then you're now putting great weight on the design code. But I mean, when I'm actually looking at the beautiful new multicoloured design code wheel of a well-designed place of climate, community and character. Safe, social, inclusive is what it says on public spaces in the headline. And I just think that the committee might have got the impression from what you've been saying that children are a focal point of this new work. But that doesn't seem to be the case in the actual design code, and the status of the design code, I'm just wondering, it's slightly overstated. It is a consideration in the whole piece on planning. It doesn't have the same status, does it, as a specific statement on children of the type that the committee is exploring today.
Yeah, currently in the system, a local plan has a higher status than the MPPF. Actually, which is and obviously what we're doing in terms of updating policy in the National Model Design Code is giving the same status to those national policies, elevating that to the same level as the local plan, and that provides an opportunity.
An opportunity,
yes.
But I just, because I think just before, and I know we've got other things to cover, but I do think that the kind of overall impression that was given is that this is all sorted because somewhere down in the deep bowels there's some guidance that Lucy touches on children and may allow people to have a space to talk about children. I think what we're trying to really get to the heart of in this session is that children and young people matter, and they should be a central part of the planning process. They shouldn't be an afterthought behind, somewhere. They're not in the headline, they're not in the climate character community, they're not in the next bit of the wheel, they're not in public space in nature, they're not in the inner bit of the wheel, they're somewhere, they're not on the wheel. Aren't our children and young people so important they should at least have a slice of the pie beyond the wheel?
Everything that you're saying, I completely agree with. The question is whether, and it'll be a question for ministers ultimately, I advise they decide as to whether or not
whether they're on the wheel.
Whether they're on the wheel, or whether they're in the policies, because the National Design Guide is almost like a set of guiding principles, 10 guiding principles, and then the National Design Code brings that to life with a series of basically really navigable sets of issues and considerations and diagrams that then bring that to life, so that a local authority can actually say, okay, right, how do I bring these principles of words to life? What do I look at in the design of a street? What do I look at in the design of a play space to make sure it's good for children? How do I actually even think about different sizes of play space in a neighbourhood? All those sorts of things. So it's very much at the centre of the policy.
Thank you very much.
I've got two quick follow-ups to Joanna Averley, then one to Dr. Gruchy. Right. You just mentioned the new wording on the MPPF. There's not one additional mention of children in that wording, is there?
No, I don't think there was, no.
Right, okay. Right, so we've got a situation where you're saying you've got all the design codes. This is the way local authorities should be treating the need for children play, other regards to children in the built environment. It's down to local authorities, both to agree planning applications along those lines and then to make sure that they are delivered. Do you ever do a review as the chief planner about whether that's actually happening in practice?
We haven't done one during my tenure.
How long's your tenure?
3.5 years.
Right.
I think what's interesting is the last review of housing quality. If it depends on what we're interested in. If we're interested in, say, housing quality in terms of schemes, then that was done by the Bartlett School at UCL a while ago against the Building for a Healthy Life standards, and that was the third iteration of a housing quality survey. The other thing we do is we're very involved, for example, in the Housing Design Awards, which actually find those schemes which are delivering on a broad set of objectives.
I think it might be a good idea to have a review.
It's always a good idea to check on practice in real time and see whether things are shifting.
Is that an answer, yes?
Yes.
Right, okay, excellent. That's something we can put to the Minister and say, the Chief Planner says you ought to be. We'll see whether he agrees with you. Right, okay.
I'll be sitting beside him, so we'll see.
Yeah, I know, yes. Right, Dr. Gruchy, just to look at what's happening briefly in Scotland and Wales. I think Scotland has national planning policies. The role of planning and supporting the population's health is specifically there. In Wales, there's a place efficiency duty. Do you think there's something that we could learn in England from those requirements in the devolved administration's policies about creating healthier lifestyles and certainly more healthy opportunities for children in particular?
I'm not hugely familiar with the Scottish and Welsh situation, but I think there's something about how, what we talked about earlier, about how we ensure across government that we look at policies or look at the impact of policies on health and how we can improve the health and well-being for the population over time. And certainly that's something that we Joanna and I do work closely together in terms of kind of sharing best practice in terms of how the planning work that she does impacts on health. Our teams in DHSC and OHID are certainly involved with Joanna's, the planning department, but also, as I've said, other active travel, supporting active design, what you've been talking about already, and supporting directors of public health in local government to work as well within local government with their planning departments and so on to try and improve the work, the policy, so that you do have improved health outputs or health outcomes.
Just a very quick example of that, when we were drafting the National Model Design Code, we borrowed a colleague from OHID who came and helped us on the health elements of the National Model Design Code, and so the dialogue about what policy should be and how it can be impactful from a health perspective is something we're commonly working on.
Okay, thank you both very much for coming this afternoon, giving us a lot of information on a lot of issues which we will reflect on. Indeed, we'll be reflecting with you, John, a little bit further in a minute. Thank you. Move on to the next panel, please. Say to colleagues, Nadia isn't well, so Kate's going to take her question.
Was Nadia done for number 7?
I presume she told Kate. Move on to our second panel, and welcome again to Minister. Again, you're coming a frequent visitor to us on a whole range of subjects, and thank you for coming this afternoon, together with your Chief Planner, who's already been giving some evidence to us at the earlier session. So thank you both very much for coming this afternoon. On this issue, very interesting issue, I think, of children in the built environment, one we haven't explored as a committee before, and are finding some interesting issues to look at. Could I say, Minister, first of all, are you as unhappy as we are that you're sat there by your ministerial self this afternoon without a colleague from another department?
I fear I may not be able to answer all your questions.
Right. I mean, we were told before by the Permanent Secretary that your officials in your department were liaising with officials in DFE, and you're working together looking at the issues of this inquiry. That hasn't happened, has it?
Well, we have a very big work plan in the department, so I'm focused on the key elements of the work plan. We're always very keen to support the department, support the committee, and the work can be done. And we work very closely with different departments at official to official level. I'm very happy to be here.
Right. Have your officials actually been talking to officials in DFE?
We talk with
about this particular inquiry.
I'm sure we have. No doubt we have, in order to try and arrange the today. And I talk with ministers on a pretty regular basis, David and others, on a variety of subjects. But has this historically been something which I have been focused on? The answer is no, because I have a large work plan which I'm having to focus on instead.
We understand that, but we also understand, I think, that the issue of children and their health and children's play, how they respond to the built environment, is clearly something that isn't just the responsibility of one department. You've got very significant responsibilities, but children looks a bit like the Department for Education, and play might be the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Children's health might be something for the Department of Health. Cross government, but it seems that cross government hasn't got its act together.
Well, how would you define getting its act together?
Well, it's talking to each other might be a start.
Well, as I say, always happy to talk. The challenge from many people, including people on this committee, is not just talk but action. So, finite resource in the department, finite ministerial resource, focus on the priorities which we put forward.
Right. Okay.
Could I just...
Yes. Go on. Yes.
Aside from the day-to-day politics of the Conservative government and who's talking to who, do you think there is a philosophical and practical problem that departments inevitably focus on the policies that are right in the middle of their remit rather than the ones that may have a broader socio-economic benefit but overlap with other departments?
I'm sure they do. In fact, I know they do. There is I've been a minister for a couple of years now, and my observations, probably straying a little bit further from the brief, but my observations are government is trying to do an awful lot at the moment, an awful lot, a significant amount of work across all remits and all types and the like. And whoever's in government will have to recognise that there is only so much capacity, there's only so much that can be done. That's not an indication of the positive or negative or the importance or otherwise of this topic. It's simply that there is a set of prioritisation that needs to happen. I think over the last 30 years, as a sort of broader principle, government has not been focused enough. It needs to be more focused.
Focused on children, for a start.
Well, government should do some things well, not lots of things badly. But I think, and that isn't what is happening at the moment, but that is the risk of where it could go if we're not careful. Now, we'll all take different ideological and philosophical viewpoints about that, but I start from a pretty robust place, which is that the government as a whole, governments across the West are trying to do too much, and they would be better off focused on a smaller number of things and doing them as well as they possibly can.
With that philosophy then, giving children around 20 to 25% of our population, children and young people, what's your department's role towards them? How do you see that in the broader terms?
My role as planning minister is to make sure that all aspects of society, everybody in society from the day they're born to the day they die, from where they come from, without talking in truisms, that the planning system works for them as best can be. But there is obviously a significant importance that we consider young people for a period of time. They won't have a voice. They are of minority age, and it is obviously important that we nurture the next generation. The planning system as a whole seeks to be as user neutral as it possibly can be, whilst recognising the importance of accommodating various parts of society where it can. So, do I think that there is a massive focus needed in the planning system on one particular part of society? Probably not, because you could make that case for everybody. You could make that case for disabled people, you could make that case for certain types of people, certain geographies, certain backgrounds, certain ethnicities, and then all you end up with is a whole heap of documents 4 years later which probably haven't moved us on a long way. So I'm an advocate of universality where possible.
Isn't children slightly different in their needs, requirements, and what we should be giving them?
Yes, which is why I said that there's an argument that because children don't have a voice, because it's very important that we nurture the next generation, that is absolutely considered. But by the same token, I think it has to be done within my philosophy is universality where possible, and I think national planning policy framework and the like that seeks to be as universal as it possibly can be.
Children aren't the same, are they, Minister? Children can't get in the car and go where they want to go. They are going to have different lifestyles to adults, different requirements, different interests. So they can't be universally treated like everyone else.
I've not said that.
Oh, sorry, I thought you had.
Well, I just said to the Chair, I accept that there is the requirement that some children minority age aren't able to express themselves, and that we have a duty to nurture the next generation. But as an overarching principle, what hierarchy, what supersedes for me, principle of universality supersedes where it can do.
Right, moving on to children's rights and participation. Tom.
Thanks. Hi, Minister. Hi. We've heard from many experts who have given evidence to this committee that children are rarely, if ever, considered in policy and decision-making related to a built environment. Is there any legal duty for public sector decision-makers to consider children as an equality group? If not, should there be?
There is, sticking closely with my brief of planning, there's broader equality conversation which I guess can be had with other parts of government. There is reference within the National Planning Policy Framework that consideration needs to be given. It is ultimately for local authorities to decide how to interpret that and then how to execute it. In any system where there is effectively a monopolist and the state is a monopolist, it sets the framework. That means you have to rely upon the state doing the right thing. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't.
Do you know whether the newly announced engagement of communities on low traffic neighbourhoods includes consulting children and young people?
I don't know that. Again, my preference is for universality in these things. I think that it is important that we take into account where we can all parts of the community, including those who, not just children, but others may find it difficult to interact, may not be able to do so. But I would be reluctant on a personal level to go into a place where we start mandating that essentially.
Because just today the Children's Commission has published a report, The Big Ambition, and the most negatively answered question by the young people who took part in the survey, only 22% of those who took part, of children and young people, felt that those who were running the country listened to what they had to say. So I understand your view that it's not something the government might, or not, perhaps not to get overly involved in, but I think it just concerns me that that many, only 22% of children and young people feel that the government listened to what they've got to say, and in their mind probably the council, the government, just the government. But either way, that's a slight concern.
There's a poll last week which suggested that a Labour MP that didn't exist had an approval rating of X. So so there is a requirement to contextualise some of the numbers in some of these reports. But it's an important point that there is a need to make sure children's voices are heard. I mean, you would hope within a system of the best part of whatever it is, 350 councils, 200 or so local planning authorities, that there was enough space there for local authorities to bring forward best practice and then for it to be copied. I think my reticence to fully agree with probably some of the direction of the questions today is not a reflection of my interest and desire to ensure that children, in the same way as adults or older people or people from a particular part of the country or disabled people, are not accommodated in this, which I think is absolutely vital. It is simply that the question in front of me is one about whether to mandate that or not, and I would be reluctant to do that.
If there's a sort of a big failure or something clearly isn't working, whatever the policy issue, central government will look to get involved. But it's, just in terms of young people and children having an opportunity to shape the environment in which they live, does the government have any data or understanding, for example, about roughly the proportion of young people that engage in the planning process, engage in local plan formation locally, consultations?
We wouldn't have that essentially. That would be entirely down to the relevant local or planning authorities to determine how to do that.
At what point, what level of alienation would be acceptable or not acceptable for the government to intervene? If young people are feeling increasingly alienated from their environment, at what point would the government intervene?
I have no plans to intervene. And I don't, Tom, I don't mean to dodge your question. From multiple levels, we will all have seen as members of Parliament elements of our local plan which were done well and elements of our local plan which were done poorly. I've seen that in my locality. I'm sure you and others have done so. I am a massive advocate of the most broad consultation and discussion that is possible within the local plan formulation and through the process, because it is so frustrating at the end of the process when people in other parts of the local plan realise that something is in there that they didn't expect, etc., etc. So we can all see as public servants the challenge of that. There is obviously obligations within National Planning Policy Framework, within the National Policy Framework for young people to be, or for a broad group of people to be considered. I would hope that would be the case. But ultimately, I think it would be very, very challenging for the government of any colour, not speaking for colleagues on the other side, to start genuinely putting in place sort of thresholds or mandates or numbers about where people felt involved or not involved. Because if we do that kind of atomisation, it ends up in a challenging place quickly.
I mean, I've been a local councillor myself. I've been on a planning committee. I understand the process. I understand how councillors and those on the planning committee are engaged with when it comes to developments, and how those councillors can influence what is in a particular development. The average age of a councillor, I think we heard it in one of our sessions. I think it's about 65 or probably north of that. My concern with that situation is that you've got a load of people on that planning committee who might have all the best desire in the world to make good decisions, but frankly, there's just a lack of young people on councils. There's a lack of those even of the kind of sort of middle-aged who might have children. So how can we, if we're putting all the power in the hands of local councils to ensure that young people have a voice in the planning process, does it concern you that actually the makeup of our councillors is in no way representative of wider society when it comes to age?
I know Joanna wants to come in a second. I don't disagree with your characterisation that parts of our local government, in the same way that parts of our central government, parts of this place, are not necessarily as representative as society as a whole. That is a perpetual challenge to try to resolve. I wouldn't advocate mandating any of that, but I think it is something that we all should have at the forefront of our minds. It is worth saying, and I know you know this, and the committee members will, that there is the National Planning Policy Framework is clear that consideration needs to be given in local plans to well-being, how things interact, to transport links, all of those things which will be at the forefront of considering young people. And then that has to go through a soundness process with an inspector representing the Secretary of State. So there is a frame. The framework should get to a place where that has been considered. I was looking at my own in North East Derbyshire's local plan just before I came here, just to have a look, because there's a very interesting question that set of questions you're asking. And there is reference there about the importance, all the way from the importance of younger people in terms of skills and the built environment, down to individual playground types, to specifically some play equipment in a particular area. So that got through the soundness test. And then within individual planning applications, you would hope that local councillors or officers would take an interest in this. I do sense it is better than when I was growing up, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So how I can evidence that is a challenge, but my sense locally and nationally is it is better. So there are checks and requirements in the system. The question would be how you mandate moving forward, as opposed to encouraging, supporting best practice, etc. Joanna, you wanted to...
Just to come in on the point about engagement of communities across the local authority area, we're doing Department of Funding quite a lot of work with digital planning, and just to explain where that makes a difference, it's about using technology to get to a much broader set of voices in the community, because traditionally the engagement in, say, the preparation of a local plan or even a major planning application is actually pretty low compared to what it should be. So digital engagement, whether that's the software and an app, or how you reach out to young people and the society at large and say this is of importance to you as a community, engage, it's showing real dividends, and it's showing that more voices come forward, and you do have a much broader, therefore, set of perspectives on the change that might be coming forward, delivery of more housing, delivery of more play space and things like that. So through that investment, what we're seeing is that you get a broader set of perspectives, and you get a sort of a broader conversation, which is really positive.
Yeah, well, it's good to hear, and I've seen examples locally where on some key local issues, young people have just, within the traditional consultation method, and young people are just hardly engaged with it. I remember one example when I was campaigning to get a local cinema in my area, and the consultation results would have you believe that it's a hugely popular idea having a cinema and everything else. But I guess my concern is this sort of slight tension between not wanting central government to get overly involved, leaving it in the hand of local councils. When I take the point about local council offices, but ultimately councillors play a crucial role in the planning process. They sit on the planning committees, and I think that it is just unhealthy when you've got a age profile that we've got on planning committees. I mean, how can we expect decisions to make? And again, what does the government do about that? Could there be a strategy to try and change makeup of councillors, and actually might it involve some decisions that aren't that popular, for example paying better allowances so it's more manageable for people to actually balance being a councillor with another job they may have to do. So I accept the fact it's difficult, but of course the reality is at the moment in lots of local council areas we've got a lot of people of a certain age doing it who are retired. Maybe a few people like me who did it when I was sort of 22, because I was sort of very into that sort of thing. But how can you make being a councillor not even attractive, but manageable for somebody who isn't a massive politico, but actually just wants to do something in their local community? They don't want to make money out of it. They just want it to be manageable. And I think, so that's a whole different issue. I know the chair's done some work on that before as well. So. Yeah.
I think that's a very fair question. It's broader than obviously we're talking about today. But as somebody else who became a councillor when I was 25, one of those unusual ones, it is a perpetual challenge.
Okay, got a supplementary?
Just very quickly, I'll just let you know, the last Labour government did a play policy, and that's because it's really important. Reduces antisocial behaviour, better health outcomes, and actually a better neighbourhood. So why don't you feel as though it's your role to put more emphasis on young people rather than just pass it on to councils? As Tom said, there's a fair mixture in it. Because if it's in your role, you've got councils and developers reminded that children have got to be a focus in any application or any proposed development.
So, rightly or wrongly, Kate, you may take the view that it's the wrong decision. I've made a choice that my focus, my priority, is going to be on speeding up the planning system.
Not children.
No, that's not what I said. I'll choose my words. My focus is on speeding up the planning system. And the reason for that is because I think the big existential question which is facing the planning system at the moment is that it's slowing down in all areas. And that doesn't help either the provision of play spaces to the point that's been talked about here, or provision for young people, or all of the very fair point, the underlying fair point which you're making, which is making sure that this provision is sufficient. But it also doesn't help younger people to get the houses which they need in the first place, which I know in other sessions and other discussions you would share my desire for that to happen. So I've been very candid with you, but my focus, not my sole focus, not the only thing I will do, hopefully I'm capable of doing more than one thing at once, but it is absolutely on speeding up the planning system. And I think as a minister it is important that I own that, so you are clear where I am focusing, because I hope that it will deliver greater benefits than to distribute myself too thinly. At the same time, it doesn't mean that this isn't important. It doesn't mean that this is an unimportant area of policy. Quite the reverse. But I have to, in some areas of my portfolio, respect the devolution settlement, and this is an area where I think local councils can lead best.
So short-term gain for long-term pain? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure that's the case, is it? Because do you think, certainly in my locality, maybe my locality is an exception, but it's been run by your party for much of my lifetime, but in my locality, I would say it is without question that provision for younger people of all sorts, play, equipment, transport, the ability to get around has improved demonstrably since I was a child. So, and that's under governments of all parties. So the trajectory is positive. How we do that, I guess, is down to our philosophical views about what to do and where to focus.
I'll leave it there.
You might have a different view about public transport anyway, but that's I generally take the point that if consultation is going to happen, it is down to local councils, that's fine. But where government requires consultation, low traffic neighbourhoods where government is saying to councils, you must go back and consult about how they're progressing, what impact they're having. Given that the impact of low traffic neighbourhoods can be very different between children and motorists, do you think there where government says you've got to consult, government ought to be saying, and you've got to consult all these groups?
I haven't honestly considered it specifically on low traffic neighbourhoods because I haven't really been involved in it in the 4 or 5 months. I mean, to try to answer your question directly, there is obviously a case to do that, Chair, and you've articulated or indicated the reason why. My concern is there's always a case to do lots of things in isolation, and in aggregate they end up being extremely problematic and slowing the whole system down.
Okay. Something about follow-up in due course. Right, on to, again, issues of safety and designing out crime and social behaviour. Mohammed.
Thank you, Chair. We heard from witnesses who had concerns that an over-restricted environment designed to prevent crime and antisocial behaviour can prevent social behaviour and children's play. So don't you think that reducing antisocial behaviour by designing out crime, such as removing benches from the park, can lead to removing positive social behaviour?
Forgive me if I misunderstand the question. As in, do I think that designing out antisocial behaviour and supporting children are in tension? Is that the point you're making?
If you over-restrict it, try to tackle the antisocial behaviour, it will stop the kids coming out and play, and also the kids with good behaviour, they will be affected as well, and they won't come out to play. So don't you think there's a risk of this policy?
Yeah, it sounds like it. In that there is always a balance to be struck in any public policy. I've seen, as I'm sure you have in Bedford, I've seen issues where things have moved too far in the wrong direction for good reasons, that things have been taken out, things have been changed, and all that happens is that it doesn't remove the problem, it sort of moves it on.
Give us an example.
Well, in terms, so there is, well, I remember back when I was a councillor, there was a big discussion about, this is many years ago, I don't remember the discussion wholly, but there was a big discussion about whether some parts of central London where I was a councillor, whether we should be allowing people to sit down, because in the evenings that might encourage people to sleep there, it may create issues with crime, etc., etc. Now, I was always a bit unconvinced about that level of formality in terms of trying to work that one through, because to me, whenever I went to look at these things, it didn't happen that often, when I went to look at these things, it was very unique to the individual location. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm, many years on, why I'm reluctant in parts of this discussion to have a very strong central view, other than it should absolutely be considered by those who have the responsibility locally, because I know, as the MP for North East Derbyshire, that there are certain areas in my patch where removing antisocial behaviour will not be achieved by taking out benches or the equivalent, but equally in other parts that might be a reasonable thing to do. But it's the local area and those people who know it best that I think would ultimately lead that conversation and most likely get it to the best outcome which works.
Okay, so how do you ensure you're not criminalising normal childhood and young people's behaviour, such as hanging out in groups in public places?
Well, I hope we wouldn't be. I'm not. Have you heard any examples of where that is the case?
It can happen. I mean, some good young people playing out, and maybe some maybe not young people not with very good behaviour playing in the same park. And if, for example, if somebody complains about it, police arrives and they might take all of them together and stuff like that. So how will the government make sure that it doesn't happen with the good people?
I don't know if we can. In that, if that, in the example that you're highlighting, Mohammed, that is a question about the operational decisions of what police do or don't do. I mean, in terms of, as long as the overall contours of design of that public space doesn't actively promote, and I'm not sure even what the definition of actually promote is, but doesn't inadvertently encourage poor behaviour, it would ultimately be for the management of that public space and then the powers that be locally to try and regulate that. I mean, and I say this from probably relatively similar viewpoint to you. I would like young people to be out more. I would like young people to be socialising more. I think that some of the challenges that we're having with
tackle mental health with the young people.
Some of the challenges we are having is the atomisation of society and the retention of younger people in their bedrooms and not developing the skills which I think is necessary. So, to your point, I think we should be encouraging this. How you mandate that through a planning system, I'm not sure. I mean, the closest I think you can get to, which I am supportive of, is appropriate design codes in a particular area, and then also national design codes, of which I'm sure you're familiar that there are some in there, and there's lots of good practice within those design codes about how to design places like this.
The white government is focusing on designing out crime, which detracts from the lack of action we have seen on restoring true neighbourhood policing, which would allow children to have a normal childhood safely.
What's your definition of neighbourhood policing?
Well, the police in the streets, police walking around, as they used to be under Labour government before 2010.
Okay, we're doing politics now.
It's not about politics, but it's restore. It's a fact.
It's not a fact.
It is a fact.
It's not a fact. I mean, it depends. Chair, I will take your guidance, but if you want me to get extremely political, I'm happy to do so. But statements like that cannot be left without some kind of comment.
And you haven't left it, so that's it.
Excellent.
Right.
So I will leave it there.
Yes.
Okay. I'll move on. So how do you guarantee that families are not threatened with eviction from their homes, especially with the complaints come from next door neighbour? This policy can put neighbours against each other. So how will you guarantee that families don't get evicted as a result of complaints from their neighbours?
My experience as a constituency MP is it's very difficult for evictions to happen in the way you've described. I have far too many examples of where real bad behaviour is happening, where we cannot get evictions. So that kind of description I've never seen that in my patch.
It's not going to happen?
Well, I'm not saying it's not going to happen. That will be down to many individual areas, many different organisations. That's both the beauty and the problem of a decentralised system, but it's one that we all respect and we all recognise is the least worst, the best way to deliver this. But my personal constituency-based experience with evictions is that the real problem cases are much more difficult to move on than the risk of people being evicted for reasons that wouldn't stand up to the average man on the omnibus.
Okay. So, do you think there would be less antisocial behaviour if children are involved? If you ask them about and involve them in the decisions about their neighbourhood, do you think it can work better if the children are involved in the policy?
I think it would be great for that to happen. I think best practice would suggest that should happen. Precisely how is down to individual councils about how they want to do it, whether they go into schools, whether they interact through some other means, online, offline. But I think that involving children is a very sensible thing to do. You have to make sure you involve the broadest range if you're going into that, because as we know, consultations, discussions can often be crowded by those who speak the loudest of any age. But if you want to, but I think it would be very sensible to incorporate and respond to the views of the broadest section of the community. Again, I have to say with a caveat that is for our colleagues in local government to decide precisely how to do it, depending upon the local area and the local approach.
So do you know any councils who are involving young people?
Yeah, Blackman.
There's lots of stuff historically, like members of the youth parliament, youth councils, interactions with schools. I'm sure you, as I do, as an elected representative, go into schools on a very regular basis. I was only in this morning I was only interacting with some schools before I came down to to London. So many different ways to do it. And I hope that in aggregate allows a significant voice for young people to be heard.
Okay, right. Moving on to the issue of levelling up. Kate.
Thanks, Chair. What has been the impact, if any, of levelling up funding for children and young people within the built environment?
Well, as in the levelling up funds which the government has allocated since 2019,
Yeah.
my guess is I wouldn't necessarily know the full answer to that. That would be more my colleague Levelling Up Minister Jacob. But trying to answer your question properly, I would expect that it will accelerate in the years ahead because, as you know, there is a substantial amount of this funding is still being spent at the moment. I can see that locally as well as nationally. And I can see, using my own experience, I can see a significant amount of levelling up funding, both going towards being supportive of the community at large, the universality, but also specifics. I can see leisure centres being transformed in my part of the world. I can see new train stations being proposed, which would improve public transport. I can see new upgrades to parks, which would help young people. So there is I know this is not a North East Derbyshire advert, but Charlie Park Leisure Centre in Clay Cross will be the best leisure centre in the area in this time next year. King George King George V Park upgrade in Staveley, the same. So we all have examples of that, and that all comes from the Towns Fund in this instance, which my constituency was very lucky to benefit from.
Okay, so I accept what you're saying, and there is a real, there should be some real benefits, but how you're actually going to measure it, I'm not quite sure. So, on the levelling up evaluations, how are you going to take into account the views of children and young people? You just listed a whole host of possibilities for future involvement with young people. So how are you going to evaluate it?
So in the two examples that I used, but the two town deals there, one, there was an explicit, and this was to credit, run by your party, Chesterfield Borough Council, they significantly involved the local secondary schools. They had lots of discussions about how to do that. And the other town deal which I'm involved in, there was also some interactions with the local schools as well. So that was a good example. I don't agree with everything that have happened on my town deals, but that was a good example of where there was interaction, where it was positive, and where it did have an impact on what was being delivered. And I would expect, given that a lot of the town deals have whatever it is, a 5-6 year timeline, that there has been enough that would have been replicated in town deals. There is the Levelling Up Parks Fund, I think it is called, which similarly has a more direct relationship with improving play space and open spaces for young people. And I would hope that some of these long-term levelling up partnerships which have now come out, which are a decade, that will give them the space to be able to think through for every part of society, local society, so that support can be given throughout. You are right, though, about the challenge of evaluation. It is a challenge to evaluate.
Of course it is, yeah. It's interesting that you recognise the benefits, and you recognise in particular that a Labour Council's done an excellent job on it, which takes me back to the previous session where for councils who don't do as well as that Labour Council, perhaps there should be more guidance from the top. But anyway, we'll move on later. You spoke again about the benefits in parks and different things. So what's your plan for the long-term maintenance of those facilities to make sure it's not a 2, 3, 4 year benefit?
So you are absolutely right that there is very little point of doing an area of our towns or our cities or our localities up for them to fall into disrepair within a few years. And it's the responsibility of local authorities as the accountable bodies underneath all of these to make sure that the things coming forward both deliver in the way that they are proposed to deliver, on time, to budget, etc., but also that they are sustainable for the long term. And many of them will be, because many, if you're upgrading leisure centres, then there is a time-honoured and long-standing process by which allows their continuity. You do have to make sure that there is sufficient support in the locality for parks, that they get the right level of support for the long term. Now, in the National Design Codes, there's obviously suggestions about how you minimise some of the problems that both you and Mohammed have rightly talked about crime and making sure they're overlooked, reducing the propensity for those kind of things to happen. So you can do it to some extent in design, recognising the tension and the balance that needs to be struck. And then it's for local authorities to make sure they've got the funds to support it going forward.
And of course, that's been part of the problem with a lot of particularly play facilities over the last, since 2010, is that local authorities have not had the resources to replace and maintain, which is why so many sort of fallen into disrepair, which I think the evidence actually shows an increase in antisocial behaviour, which of course puts additional burden onto the police. So I know you said earlier that you're sort of working on the here and now, short-term gain for long-term pain, and I think this is another example. Money's been invested, but no guarantee to maintain that investment in the future.
Well, I mean, let me just respond to that in two ways, and I'm sorry for deviating into politics, but you all tempt me too much. We wouldn't have to have made the decisions that we've made since 2010 if the overspending hadn't happened in the decade before that. But that is a discussion which we have had many times before that, and it is a salutary lesson for governments of all parties that you can neither abolish the economic cycle nor drive up debt to GDP ratios to a point where you have to take very difficult decisions. But broadly, I don't accept your characterisation about short-term gain for long-term pain. All of the work that we're doing in the department at the moment is all about trying to ensure that the planning system has a strategic focus for the long term. But we cannot denude local authorities of agency. It would be incorrect of me to accept the contention that central government is just there to sort of fix everything that local government has. Otherwise, there's no point for local government. You should saw off half of your committee's name. Local government has agency. It has a necessity to take decisions in a thoughtful, competent, careful manner, and then to execute them over the long term for the good of their society. If they're not able to do that, they should definitely be voted out. But the question is why they're in it in the first place.
I was in local government for a long, long time, and I've always seen it as a partnership working between national and local. And I've seen that national provides the support, advice and part of the resources to deliver for the good of local communities. Unfortunately, what we seem to be experiencing is a diktat from the top that doesn't seem to have considered the unintentional consequences of decisions, which has actually created a lot of the social problems we've got now. But that's
what's the diktat, Kate?
If you look at your anything you've not you personally, but anything the government comes out with, councils must do this. Where's the resources? And you said earlier that you put investment in for the levelling up to provide some facilities, but there's no maintenance going forward to make them sustainable. So you've got a nice headline, we've invested whatever amount, but nothing to say what's going to happen to that facility in 5 years. So it's a constant battle.
So sorry, just so I'm clear then, because this is exactly the point about how public policy makes. So not only should central government hand out capital to change local areas, they should also hand out perpetual dowries to make sure that they work for our lifetimes, our children's lifetimes, our grandchildren's lifetimes. How much Ardell do you want to hand out with all of the capital, just so I'm clear?
Well, if we could go back to the same levels of funding per head as we had in 2008, 2009, it would perhaps be okay. But if you look at places, and a number of places, not just my area, have the budgets cut in real terms on average by 23%. Now, it's great to get a bit of levelling up money, but if you don't have the resources to maintain that and keep it it's actually a waste, isn't it?
Well,
so it is for government to fund adequately local authorities, and it's important that government gives local authorities responsibility, because I think they deliver well in the main, but it's also important to give them the resources to deliver on that. And perhaps that's a conversation you and I can have separately, because I do need to move on.
Yes, I think
to
we
the
have
next
to
set
get
of
back to the
questions.
precise subject of the inquiry. It'll be helpful.
We'll have a coffee later.
let's do it.
One of the recommendations of the Competition and Markets Authority market study of the house building sector was to take back public amenity spaces from the house builders and developers into the hands of local authorities. Another example. Do local authorities have the capacity to maintain these spaces for the benefit of children and young people?
Well, we're considering the CMA report at the moment, so forgive me that I can't give you a full answer to that, but my Secretary of State will, and the government will come out with further information going forward. It is for local authorities to negotiate how they want to approach these things. I realise that we are slightly straying from the brief, but local authorities have had a challenging time at points over the last few years, but it is important that we recognise that there is £65 billion in that system. It is a significant amount of money, and there is also quite a number of local authorities with quite a large number of reserves in the background. So always important that we reflect that without taking away from the broader point, which I know the Chair probably will be very keen for me to acknowledge, which is there are challenges in the system, which I accept. It is ultimately, I have a lot of sympathy with the underlying point that you are making. I think there has been a move on some of these freehold estates over 20 years that I am not sure most people would necessarily be in agreement of. That is a set of decisions that have been taken either by commission by the developers or by omission by the local authorities. They were being taken when there was lots of money in the system, pre-2010, and they have been taken post-2010, when, to your description, although not mine, there may have been less money in the system. So one of the things that we're trying to do through the leasehold bill is make sure that there is greater clarity about who is paying for what. And we've also said that we will consider this area further, and we may have more to say about it in the Lords.
Okay. Given the healthy financial position of house builders highlighted in the CMA report, should they be using that profit to provide more and better spaces for children? And I think we've discussed this previously. I think it was about 3.9 billion in profit. 1.8 billion went to shareholders. Should some of that money be spent to invest better in services for children and young people on a new development?
Well, I'm not here to defend the developers. I mean, quite the reverse. The developers, have had quite a challenging time from my Secretary of State. They're currently at 3 billion and counting on remediation, and rightly so. And they will now resolve 1,500 plus buildings of which they caused. But to your point, the developers are going to develop in a way which local councils and local planning authorities and local councillors sitting on those planning authorities determine. So I have sympathy with your point that says we need to make sure, well, lots of sympathy with your point that we need to make sure that when new developments come forward, that they're done in a way which works for the local community who will live there for many generations to come. That is for our colleagues in local government to make sure that they are conditioning and approving in a way which does that, both that balances off the need to get things built in the right place, but also to bring the right services with them.
Okay, and finally, should more strings be attached to the sale of public land, which would benefit the health and lives of young people? They tend to get public land fairly cheaply. Should be more strings attached to that?
Is there an example that you can give me of where that's happened?
Sorry?
Is there an example where you can give me where that's happened?
Where?
Public land being sold. Is there a specific example of public land being sold off very cheaply where?
No, I don't on this, but I'm sure we can get you some, because it's quite common for councils to say that will bring in the houses that Rowley wants in quickly, and land's negotiated, providing the developer builds to some sort of level. But perhaps it's something you should consider, that if local authorities are being generous with land to developers, there should be more strings attached to what should be included in that development site.
Ultimately down to local councils and the developers to have that conversation, and there's a balance that needs to be struck there. I think from the previous conversations we've started in this committee, there is a valuability challenge at the moment about building houses in general, and so unless we as a country, unless you as a committee, unless me as a minister are starting to have a much more deeper conversation about population growth, which is ultimately driving this demand, then we have to build more houses. We have to build them in the right places, with the right services, with the right infrastructure, but we have to build more houses. And so there is an imperative to do that. I want houses that are in the right place, with the right services and the right amenity, and that is ultimately for our colleagues in local government to make sure that that happens, because I do not know the answer about what is best in Bedford or Blackburn or Burnley or Northampton South, or I do hope I do know what's roughly best in North East Derbyshire. But we have to accept that locally decisions will have to be made. But yes, I want to see that, but I also have to ensure that more houses are built and create systems which will encourage that, because that is a necessity given our population growth over the last decade.
Okay. Just to make a very political point to respond to one or two others, just to point out that the first 10 years of the last Labour government, public sector debt actually fell, and it only increased when the financial crisis, the international financial crisis, hit.
Yes, and of course, Chair, you will accept that the previous member for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath overspent every single year from 2004 onwards, many years before.
Still get the public sector debt down. That wasn't a bad.
Still overspent, and I remember that my Keynesian economics suggested that you had to pay down significant amount of public debt, which had risen from 27% in the 30s between 97 and 2008.
We can probably have the argument going on. But
I look forward to it.
Okay. Right, Andrew, back to our subject today.
Thank you. Yes, very much so. I wondered if you'd picked anything up, or both of you really, had picked anything up from the approach that other countries have taken to young people and the built environment. It's much more common to see children walking and cycling alone or with groups without adults in other countries, and I wondered whether that was just a purely cultural phenomenon or whether there was something about the built environment that encouraged that to happen.
I think there probably is. I'm going to defer to Joanna on this one. I have talked with Joanna and team about some of it, and they showed me examples of places like, I think, Austria and Belgium, and I know from your previous role you would probably have seen a significant amount of that. But Joanna, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think what's always fascinating is I think it's a combination of the both. So if we think of Holland, which is obviously a cycling nation, then the infrastructure is there to support cycling, but there was never probably a drop in cycling as we would have seen in the UK, and then it's rising again in many of our cities. And so whether or not the sort of culturally, the sort of pattern of behaviour in terms of choices towards active travel was sustained, or whether it dropped to a level where the road space basically went over to cars. There's lots going on, obviously, following the publication of Gear Change and set up of Active Travel England to start to sort of move that dial back again, and obviously Manchester and Chris Boardman and others are doing quite a lot of work on that, as they are also in London. I think the other examples that I think are fascinating, if you go to Japan, there just is a general sense of safety in the community. So very young children travel independently on public transport. Again, that's quite cultural, but Japan is also fascinating because they are very comfortable with the degree of surveillance as well. So it's a sort of society that's quite accepting of and is very strong in terms of sort of public behaviour and what's an acceptable level of sort of surveillance and looking out for others in the community. So again, it combines, and it's, for example, if you're in Tokyo, it's a very, very detailed and very comprehensive public transport system. So it's a combination of both, the built environment, how we've shaped it over the last years, and sometimes how we're trying to retrofit it for walking and cycling, and sometimes also just cultural norms and whether they have been consistent or are shifting back towards walking and cycling.
One of the cultural phenomena seemed to be a lot of the proliferation of sort of no ball games, particularly with the social housing estates. Don't play here, don't make a noise. And I wondered whether there's any sort of shift in in planning views or DLUC, take Lee's point very much. I don't want central government saying you're not allowed to have no ball game signs here, and we'll send a government inspector to this site to make sure your signs are the right size and all that sort of thing. But just in terms of mood music about ball games and play, I wondered if there's much on that. And also, and this gets back to the chairman's very sensible point about DFE, DLUC, crossover and the importance for that within this, that and you're right, Lee, when I was an MEP, we used to go on these sorts of visits with the Education Committee. In places like Holland, they don't have 2.5 metre fences all the way around their schools, even if they're right in the middle of a city or a town, because they regard it as everybody's job to look after their children rather than fencing them off and sort of forgetting about them. And I wonder if there's any thoughts about planning in that respect as well.
So I guess that we all probably have examples. I certainly do in my patch, or my previous council patch, where there was large development of social housing in the 50s, 60s and 70s, whereby basically all the ground around it is dead space. It is almost impossible to use. There is no facilities around it. There's no formal play and the like around, and that we have to move away from. There is a that kind of level of design which we're all working through in different parts of the country, which just hasn't worked. One of the reasons why there's a lot of regeneration going on. And I think a lot of the design codes, not an expert in this, a lot of design codes help create framework which encourages a new development in that direction. I went to see Woodbury Down Estate in Hackney, which is a 20-30 year programme of regeneration, and the step change in thinking about this is demonstrable, not just in good projects where there's been a lot of work by the council and by the master developer there to do that, but also I think you can see, so there is definitely a move in the right direction here. But ultimately, it is for local authorities to try and catch this, because we want to move away from the no ball games culture, to where it's integrated properly, so that you don't have to sort of ban things, because otherwise the area would just problems will happen. So yeah, I think there is more to do, but it has moved in the right direction.
What's often happening in schools where you've got particularly an urban school, I can think of this anecdote, but I can think of 2 examples when an expansion of the school actually used a little bit of the local park, but the quid pro quo was much better facilities for the community, and when the school didn't need them after 3:30, they were open to the community. So it's a win-win both for the school in terms of the provision for sort of more formal education, but also for the community in terms of better sports and play provision. So you can get it to work, and that's about being creative about a design process for schools, for example, and dual use of particularly the landscape and the facilities that sit around a school, as well as sometimes within the school you can have.
I think we need to make it work in terms of having a greater level of preparedness to see an overall benefit versus a specific disbenefit. So if you fence your school off, then you don't worry that there's an issue, and then you get blamed because that child's been abducted or X things happen. Whereas no one gets the credit if that entire community is better because the children are part of it and everybody interacts with it.
On a personal level, and beyond my scope here, but on a personal level, I have a lot of sympathy for the point you're making. When back in the 90s, when I was at secondary school, it was an open site, and I go back there now, representing the constituency a few hundred metres away from it. It is now entirely closed. I don't know whether that is it's not nothing to do with school, it's a brilliant school, but that is just a general move across the country, and I don't know, that's something probably we all need to reflect on.
Yeah. Design's at the heart of it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chairman.
Okay, just a couple of final points. On a philosophical point, we've talked about different ways in which different countries deal with these issues, differences in approach in Austria or Netherlands or Germany. It's a culture. Do you think it's government's job, Minister, to try and change or at least influence the culture?
Wow. Final question. So let me try and break that one down. I definitely think it's government's job to understand what is going on elsewhere in the world. And it's something that governments don't do well enough. And Joanna and I have been, for other areas of planning policy, we've interacted with other countries, and I want to do that in more detail. And I will absolutely take away some of the points that you have made on this. Also trying to do it on nationally significant infrastructure projects, trying to get a meeting with somebody in Norway on Teams to try and understand some of the things that they're doing there, which we've been. So I absolutely think it's our role to understand what other countries are doing. I even accept that it is certainly the role of central government to set out exemplar best practice, to work through, to highlight where things are done well. I hope the codes do that. Planning policy framework, I hope, goes some way towards doing that. All governments have, it's very philosophical, in terms of changing culture, that's a very difficult thing to both define and to execute, but culture changes. So the question is whether government leads it or not.
Right. Or even encourage it?
Sometimes.
This is probably one for down the pub, I think.
Are you buying the pie?
I will buy on this occasion, yes.
Okay. But I think it's an interesting issue because, it clearly is one of the differences when you look at just travelling to school and the infrastructure we have, but also how people deal and respond to that, I think is just a challenge that we all get in our constituencies on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Joanna, for coming and giving evidence this afternoon. Order. That brings us to the end of our public proceedings.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.